Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Doctors In podcast. I am your host, Dr. Nadia Sabeh. Today, we are going to talk about vapor pressure deficit and why it is so important to the health and yield and quality of the plants that you're growing indoors and in greenhouses. If you are following along on YouTube, I have a slideshow that I'm using to guide this conversation. But if you're listening at home or while you're working or in the car, you should be able to follow this without necessarily the visuals of this PowerPoint presentation. All right, so today in the episode, we're going to talk about why do plants need humidity control? What is VPD and how does it compare to relative humidity? How does VPD and humidity control affect our plant's yield and quality? And then we're going to talk about, well, what happens if you don't have the right VPD, if it's too high or too low? And then, of course, I'm going to try to answer the question that I know all of you want the answer to, which is what is the right VPD for your crop? All right, so let's get into it. So, why do plants need humidity control? Well, really, it's to support and promote the process of evapotranspiration, which is the movement and release of water through and out of the plant. And it's really responsible for water and nutrient delivery through your plant. Now, evapotranspiration is a compound word, so it combines two words, evaporation and transpiration. Evaporation is the process at which, water evaporates into the air, just like a wet wall, right? Where we're evaporating water from that wet wall and into the air. Same idea here. The plants are going to evaporate water that is in their stomata. The second word is transpiration. And this is the process that plants use to transport water from the roots through the shoot and to the various plant parts in order to distribute nutrients around to the plant. So, evapotranspiration is super critical to our crop for a multitude of reasons. First and foremost, it is responsible for the delivery of water and nutrients from the root zone up through the shoot, and then, like I said, to the other various plant parts. So, this means that evapotranspiration is essential to the growth of our crop, right? To the health and nutrient delivery of our crop, as well as to any sort of stress triggers to the plant, right? Just like a human, if we are well nourished, right, and we're feeling healthy, our immune system is going to be better than when we're stressed and we're tired, right? And we're just sort of kind of fighting for survival. So we can really boost the plant's ability to ward off disease by keeping the plant healthy through evapotranspiration. Another very interesting purpose for evapotranspiration is that for non-woody plants, it actually helps to hold the plant upright. The turgor pressure that gets created as one water molecule pulls the next water molecule behind it, is that it creates a pressure within the plant that holds it upright. That's why when the plant isn't well watered, or if we shut down the evapotranspiration process, our plant begins to wilt. It's that turgor pressure that's holding it up. And so, related to that is that evapotranspiration helps to create or helps to support the cellular structure of the plant. So, very important to keep our plant upright and healthy. Also, the evaporation part of evapotranspiration is really important to the plant by helping it evaporatively cool itself. This is one of the ways that it can actually regulate its own temperature and regulate its own heat stress, is that if it can freely evaporate water and evaporatively cool itself, then it can ward off stress related to heat. And the last thing is that it really affects photosynthesis. You might not realize that, but one is, right, if we're using evapotranspiration to help, deliver water and nutrients to the plants, that's going to be really helpful to the other processes in the plants, right, that are going to convert carbon dioxide into sugars, into the building blocks that grow the plant. And so evapotranspiration is super duper important, which is why humidity is so important. So, what are the ways in which we think about humidity as growers? Well, the first parameter, right, that you automatically think of when we think about humidity is relative humidity. What is relative humidity? Relative humidity is the ratio of the vapor pressure of the air at a given temperature versus the vapor pressure of saturated air at that same temperature. So it's a ratio. That's why it's a percentage, because it's one value over another value of the same measure of unit. So so relative humidity is tricky because it really depends, that percentage depends on the temperature of air, where colder air can't hold as much moisture as warm air. So for a given content of water, the percentage will be different depending on what the temperature is. It doesn't really tell us anything about how much water is in it. It just tells us how much water is in the air compared to, right, relative to what the air could hold. So if you're watching the YouTube video, you see that I have these water droplets, right? So at 10 degrees Celsius, we could have a certain quantity of water that represents 100% relative humidity. But then if we just double the temperature of the air from 10 degrees to 20 degrees Celsius, we will now be at a relative humidity of 50% without changing anything about the content of air. We're just changing the size of the glass, the size of the vessel that can hold that water vapor. And then if we increase the temperature again by another 30%, now all of a sudden the relative humidity is only 30%, not because we removed or dehumidified the air, but just because the temperature of the air increased. So this relationship between temperature and humidity is why we call it relative humidity. The humidity is relative to the temperature of the air, and it doesn't really tell us anything about how much water is in the air. So, what is vapor pressure deficit? Well, vapor pressure deficit still uses those same units of measure. It still uses the vapor pressure of the air, but now instead of looking at a ratio of a percentage, now we're looking at an actual difference in how much water vapor is in the air versus how much water vapor could be held in the air at saturation, again at the same temperature, but now we're looking at a difference, at a delta. So there are two ways that we think of vapor pressure deficit. One is using the room temperature. So what is the vapor pressure of the air at a given room temperature versus how much water vapor that air can hold if it was saturated at the same temperature. That's what we call water, or what we call vapor pressure deficit, which is traditionally what we term VPD. Now, there's another way to measure VPD, which is the vapor pressure difference, which you might also hear. And this is where we look at what the vapor pressure is of the air versus the saturation vapor pressure at the leaf temperature instead of the air temperature. So this would be your actual vapor pressure difference or vapor pressure deficit, is when we're looking at the water vapor pressure of the air at the air temperature versus the saturated vapor pressure of at leaf temperature. And the reason we're looking at saturation vapor pressure in the first place with the leaf is that when that water, right, moved from the root through the shoot and now to the stomata, it is still technically liquid water right before it evaporates. And that liquid water is what is saturated water. And so we really want to know what is the vapor pressure at the leaf temperature that's holding that water versus the vapor pressure of the air. Now, a lot of people are really adamant that we need to know the leaf temperature, but I'm just going to tell you right here, even if you're just using the air temperature to figure out your VPD, I'm going to be happy with that because it's really hard to measure leaf temperature everywhere. How do you choose which leaf you're going to measure the temperature and then calculate the saturation vapor pressure for? So, a lot of you have air temperature sensors in your grow. So, if you're just using VPD based off of those air temperature sensors, I'm going to be thrilled that you're using that as your control parameter. So again, if you're watching the YouTube video, this is a psychrometric chart, and this is one way that I like to visualize VPD. So we have the vapor pressure of the air at a given temperature, and then you see this vertical line where we're going to hit the saturation vapor curve, and that's the saturation vapor pressure that we're finding the difference, the delta in vapor pressure at saturation versus vapor pressure of the air. So, what characterizes a high versus a low vapor pressure deficit? Well, a high VPD is characterized by dry air. Okay, it has a low relative humidity typically for that given temperature, which means it has a low quantity of water vapor in the air. Now, if you are a low vapor pressure deficit, it's the opposite. It's very humid air. We have a high relative humidity and a high water vapor content of the air. Now, I have two mnemonic devices that I use to remind myself of what high versus low VPD is. So, high VPD, I always think of the Radiohead song, High and Dry, right? Don't leave me high and dry. That is high VPD, is a dry environment. Now, if you prefer, more R&B and rap, then maybe you like Lil Jon's song Get Low, right? Where he sings to the window, to the wall, to the sweat drops down, right? So very humid. Think about sweat. We're not evaporating water because it's too saturated in the air. So those are my two mnemonic devices that I like to use to remind myself of what is high versus low VPD. So, how does VPD exactly affect evapotranspiration? Well, we know that the higher the VPD, okay, the drier the air, the more your plant is going to transpire because that delta, that difference in the vapor pressure of the air versus the saturation vapor pressure of the liquid water in the stomata is high. So when we have a high delta, a high VPD, then we're going to put more pressure on the plant to transpire and then evaporate that water into the air. What this also means is that we're going to need more water and nutrients to feed to the roots because it's going to be using it so quickly. So one thing I want you to keep in mind is that if you have a high VPD and your plants are transpiring and evapotranspiring at a high rate, then you might need to water them more and deliver more nutrients in order to prevent them from wilting because they run out of water at the root zone. How does VPD affect yield? Well, there's a lot of research on a lot of different crops that show that at a high vapor pressure deficit, the stomatal conductance actually decreases. And stomatal conductance is related to gas exchange. Okay, so that means that not only could we actually reduce the amount of water that gets evaporated, but we could also reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that comes into the stomate, into the plant to do photosynthesis. And so, what this ultimately means is that we'll have lower rates of photosynthesis and lower yields at a higher VPD when the air is really dry. And I know nobody wants that. How does VPD affect evapotranspiration? So, it's tricky, right? Because I just said that high VPD increases evapotranspiration, but there is a point for every single crop where if you have such a high VPD, the plant will actually go into a drought resistant mode and close the stomata to protect itself, right? Because it wants to conserve water. This is what happens with xeriscaping or desert plants is that they actually close their stomata when it's really hot and dry outside, and then they open them again at night when it's cooler and a little bit more humid, relatively humid. And so what can happen is that if you have too high of a VPD, right? Like I just said that it could decrease the stomatal conductance. Well, now it could actually just close the stomates altogether, which of course is going to cause nutrient deficiencies and reduce that transport process. And your plants might wilt also if it's a very high VPD, even if you're providing it enough water. What about the growth cycle? So, for those of you who steer your cannabis crops or your tomato crops, you probably already know, right, that if you stress the plant with a higher VPD, right, you lower that relative humidity, you lower that temperature to stress the plant, what happens, right? It goes more into a generative response. And the reason is because we're stressing that plant, right? The plant says, oh my God, I'm going to die. I better reproduce, right? Produce flower. If you were a male plant, cannabis plant, you'd be producing more pollen, right? Because it's survival. Right. And so you want to go into reproductive mode when you're stressed out. So if you increase the VPD beyond a certain threshold for your crop, you are going to cause it to go into a generative response, right? Which can be good or bad depending on what you are trying to accomplish. If you are growing a lettuce plant, you certainly do not want it to start flowering and seeding, right, by growing it under a high VPD condition. What about quality? So, honestly, I think more about VPD in terms of the quality of the crop than I do necessarily about the yield and growth of the crop because this is one of the first signs, right? Quality is one of the first signs that we know that something is wrong with the vapor pressure deficit. So, there are two deficiencies. One is abiotic and biotic deficiencies. The abiotic deficiency that you see when you have a VPD that's too high or too low and your stomates are closing is that you get a calcium deficiency. And this is usually characterized by leaf tip burn or scorched tips, depending on your lingo, or blossom end rot. If you're growing, say, a tomato or a pepper plant, you'll see these black bottoms, which we call a rot, but it has nothing to do with a fungus or a mold. It's literally a lack of calcium. And I know that some tomato and pepper growers out there, they will actually walk around. This is not lore, this is true. They will walk around, they will crush Tums, okay, which is calcium carbonate, basically. They will crush it, then put it, dissolve it in a water bottle, shake it up, and then they'll literally spray the bottom of their fruits to add calcium directly to the bottom of their fruits. I don't know lettuce growers that do that for their leaf tip burn, but possibly it could work. But we don't really want to be spraying anything on our crops after the fact that they have a calcium deficiency, right? We'd much rather just prevent that calcium deficiency in the first place. And the reason why calcium becomes deficient in these crops through VPD is because calcium is different than other macro or micronutrients. It does not move through the plant through diffusion, right? Through the difference between a high concentration and a low concentration of that mineral. It gets deposited through water. So it actually moves with the stream of water that's flowing through the plant. So if you have a really high VPD, what can happen is that your plant transpires so quickly that it basically leaves the calcium behind and it can't deliver the calcium to all the parts of the plants that it's just blowing through. If your VPD is too low and you have a really high relative humidity and you slow down the transpiration process, now the calcium can't move, right? It's going to move very slowly through the plant. And so you could have an accumulation of calcium in certain parts of the plant and a lack of calcium in other, usually younger parts of the crop. So, calcium deficiency is one of the first signs that something is wrong with evapotranspiration that might be mitigated through better VPD control. The other deficiencies are biotic deficiencies. And biotic means, right, it's biological. And what I'm really talking about are molds. So the two that get affected most by poor VPD control are powdery mildew and botrytis. So, what I want to say about powdery mildew is that, so many of my cannabis growers are so fearful of mold growth, right? I totally get it, especially on your flowers, because if it doesn't pass labs, right, that's $1 million or whatever out the door. And so many cannabis growers out of that fear, right? They relate moisture to mold. Totally understandable. That is absolutely true, right? Mold spores need water in order to sporulate. But the trick with powdery mildew is that it actually transports itself through dry air. So powdery mildew spores are actually enhanced. Their transport and distribution is enhanced through dry air. So when I walk into a grow and there are fans blowing at 1,000,000 miles per hour and the VPD is really high and they say that they have a VPD or they have a powdery mildew issue, unfortunately, I'm not surprised. And it's a really hard sell sometimes to convince them to lower the VPD, aka raise the humidity, the amount of water vapor in the room, and convince them that that's actually going to help reduce the risk of powdery mildew. Though the growers who have followed that advice have all come back to say that they have almost no powdery mildew anymore, that it's basically being mitigated to levels that, they didn't ever expect was possible, which is near zero in most cases. Though, of course, getting rid of any mold once you have it in its entirety is almost impossible. Okay, so botrytis is the other one, right? And if we don't have good VPD control and we let the water stay saturated at the leaf, at the stomata, at the flower, then now, right, we do have a moisture problem and spores, both powdery mildew and botrytis, will be able to sporulate and grow in that wet environment at that saturated point, right, surface of the plant where it's not able to freely evaporate the water. But if that water could be evaporated, there would be nowhere for those mold spores to grow, right? Okay. So VPD has a huge effect on the quality of our plants and the health of our plants. So, just to summarize what happens when the VPD is too high or too low, okay? It's really about managing evapotranspiration, right? So when the VPD is too high, we're going to have a high evapotranspiration rate. You could have wilting, which is low turgor pressure if we're not just right giving the plant enough water to make up for that high evapotranspiration rate, which means we're going to have a high water usage, high nutrient consumption, all going to the costs to grow your crop, right? We also have a high risk of calcium deficiency and reduced carbon dioxide uptake by reduced stomatal conductance. And ultimately, at a high VPD, we're creating a stressful environment for the plant, which is going to force it to want to go into a generative growth, right, to reproduce before it dies. It's going to increase the risk of powdery mildew. And ultimately, it's going to reduce the yield and quality and what our sellable product could be in the end. Now, if your VPD is too low, it's not as risky, believe it or not, if we have a more humid environment. Can you believe that? Um, yes, we'll slow evapotranspiration down, which could lead to a calcium deficiency. We might also get guttation on the ends of the leaves, right? So if there's a really high root pressure because we watered that plant, but there's not enough pressure on the plant to transpire and evaporate that water, we can actually have water kind of seep out the ends of the leaves trying to find a place to grow. Now, if you're a strawberry grower, this actually can be beneficial because guttation carries with it sugars, which also carry with it, right, the all the goodies that make strawberries sweet and tasty. But for most other crops, we usually want to avoid that. And if your VPD is low, you're also really driving the plant towards more vegetative growth, right? It's really comfortable and happy. There's no stress. So why would it ever fruit or flower? Um, but also we risk botrytis by having potentially wet spots or places where the plant can't freely evaporate the moisture, right, that's on it or that's kind of stuck at the ends of the leaves or in the stomata. And so we do increase the risk for sporulation of any fungus that might have landed on your plant. And, and ultimately that can lead to low quality as well. So, the burning question I know you all have, which is what is the right vapor pressure deficit? Well, as any good engineer would respond, my answer is it depends, right? It depends on your crop. It depends on the stage of your crop. And it also depends on what you're even capable of achieving with the system that you have. In most cases, I recommend targeting a VPD of 1 kilopascal. For most crops, this is a great place to start. It is going to support both vegetative and fruiting, flowering growth. So if you can get to 1 kilopascal, you are doing great. Now, if you really are leaning more vegetative, you're growing a lettuce crop, a culinary herb, clones, right? The vegetative state of your cannabis crop, then you actually want to push the VPD a little lower than 1 kilopascal. Zero point 0.8 to 1 kPa is really ideal for vegetative growth. Now, if you have a flowering crop like cannabis or tomatoes and peppers, then you want to maybe inch that VPD up to 1 to 1.25 kilopascals to really induce that stress response and that generative growth. Now, if you are a cannabis grower and you really want to stress those girls out, right, in order to get them to pop more trichomes and terpenes and colors, right? That then you might stress it even more to something above 1.25 kilopascals. I don't recommend anything higher than 1.5 kilopascals because that's the point at which stress will become disease. So if you can avoid going above 1.5 kilopascals, you're still going to get that great stress response. You just will also be able to maintain the plant's natural immunity against those biotic deficiencies. So we have charts on our website for different crops that show you for a given temperature what relative humidity would equate to the vapor pressure deficit you want, depending on if you're in a vegetative, flowering, or stress response kind of situation. We also have an app for that. We have a VPD app. I know many of you are using it out in your greenhouses and in your indoor grows. I love that. We have 3 different calculators on our VPD app. One is to measure the typical traditional VPD, vapor pressure deficit, based on air temperature and air relative humidity. So if you know what those two values are from, say, your monitoring system, then you can plug those numbers in and see what vapor pressure deficit you are achieving with that combination of temperature and humidity. Now, if you are walking around with an infrared thermometer and can take leaf temperature measurements, then maybe you want to measure the vapor pressure difference, okay, that VPD. And so now what you do is you would input the air temperature, the leaf temperature, as well as the air relative humidity, because we need to know that still to figure out what is the vapor pressure at the air temperature. And then you hit calculate and you will get the actual vapor pressure difference for that particular plant. Remember, that's going to be an individual plant. That's one of the reasons why I like vapor pressure deficit, is that it gives you kind of an overall view for your entire crop, not just one individual plant. Now, I know many of you guys have, third-party control systems or a control system for your HVAC system where you can plug in the temperature and humidity targets. Very few are out there that actually allow you to plug in your VPD target. So what you can do is you can actually work backwards. You can look at the chart and say, hey, for this given temperature, right, I want a vapor pressure deficit of 1. And then what you can do is you can plug in that temperature, plug in your target VPD, and it will calculate what the relative humidity of the air would need to be to achieve that VPD. So now you can say, oh, let's say I'm at 80 degrees over here on the chart and I want 1 kilopascal, then that's equal to 70% relative humidity. So rather than looking at this chart, you would plug in 1 kilopascal, 80 degrees, and it would calculate 70%. And you can plug that right into your controller. And that's what you would be controlling your relative humidity and VPD based off of. So, all right, in summary, what is VPD, right? It is vapor pressure deficit, and it's the difference between how much water vapor is in the air versus how much water vapor the air could hold if saturated. Why is VPD so important for plant growth? So many reasons. It controls plant evaporation, evapotranspiration. It affects water uptake and nutrient delivery. It holds the plant upright. It helps plants manage their internal temperature through that evaporative cooling process. And it influences crop yield, quality, and ultimately stress. And what is the right VPD? Well, it depends on the crop and its growth stage. So ultimately, to summarize, our goal is to put just the right amount of pressure on our plants to transpire and grow healthily, right? If we have a high VPD, we'll have a high evapotranspiration rate and a lot of stress. If we have a low vapor pressure deficit, we'll have a low evapotranspiration rate, and your plants will never be stressed and they'll always stay vegetative, right? But you might start seeing some nutrient deficiencies. What we want to find is the right VPD to get to the right evapotranspiration rate for your crop, for the stage of your crop, and even for the facility and the systems that you're using to grow your crop, right? We are trying to find the Goldilocks VPD value for your crop under different situations. So, thanks so much for tuning in to today's podcast episode. If you want to know what's your VPD, please download our VPD app. If you're already using it, please give us a rating of 5 stars, leave some comments about why you love it or what you would even like for it to improve. I saw one comment just the other day that said that they wanted leaf temperature. Well, it's there. So please download the latest version if you haven't. And I also recently just uploaded a how-to video on how to use the VPD app. So if you're not sure how to use all those different screens, please follow along and I do a walkthrough for all of you. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I can't wait to hear from you and talk to you again for the next episode. Thanks.